podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Humans of Speedway podcast, where we talk to some of the people who make up the Speedway community, both on and off the track. Now, some of these people you will know, perhaps others less so, but all of them have dedicated their lives to the sport in some way. I'm Ian Brannan, and joining me in this episode is one of British Speedway's most prolific promoters, Neil Machin. Like so many of us, Neil went along to the Speedway, in this case in Sheffield, one night in his youth. But who could have foreseen the journey that would become, meeting one of his best mates, taking that club to league championships, and becoming the godfather of Britain's most successful rider in the history of the sport. It's been quite a ride, to coin a very intentional pun, and I'm pleased to say joining me now to tell just some of it in his own words is the former Sheffield and Leicester promoter, Neil Machin. Welcome, Neil.
Good morning, Ian, and your following listeners, shall we say?
Well, I think there's at least three. So with you here, that's four.
Okay, we might know them all personally then between us, eh?
It's a small world. So we're here to talk about your life and times, really, in many ways, and you've had many in the Speedway world. But let's go right back to the very start. You as a young man, cutting quite a strut around Sheffield, I imagine, once upon a time. What was your sort of early life like, and when did you first attend Speedway?
Well, Ian, that's a very good starting point, I think. I would have probably been about 12 years old. I didn't even know about Speedway. I'd never heard of it. My pal from school said, "Oh, we're off to Speedway." What the hell's that? And hey, long story short, I arrived at Overton Stadium. I was absolutely blown away with all the odd-sounding names and the rivalry and the banter on the terraces and the noise and the different people and I couldn't wait for the following Thursday. To be honest, I was hooked right from day one, and I guess that influenced what happened donkey's years later, in a way, to some extent, Ian.
Yeah, and obviously that was a different time then, wasn't it, in terms of the crowds and the whole sort of experience than probably what you would expect it to have now. Yeah,
and I think it sort of set the scene in my thinking because, of course, in the early 60s, going to a place like Overton Stadium, there would have probably been 4,000 or 5,000 people in the terraces, and it was a fairly noisy affair, and of course, as I say, it was the banter from the terraces and the excitement and the passing and the needle and the occasional handbags, if we can say that, that sort of lit my fire, and of course, years and years and years later, I'd got that point of reference where I believed I could resurrect it in part anyway. So it was an influence, and hey, I suppose I didn't realise that day when I was 12 years old, when I first went to Overton, how it was actually going to influence and change my entire life. I have to say, in hindsight, not such an upheaval. We take rough with the smooth. I could talk to you about all the negative and all the soul searching and all the disappointments and problems and losing my partner when I was 2 or 3 years into thing, but I'm sure we'll come on to that later. So yeah, who could have foreseen what a 12-year-old, how he was going to be influenced throughout his entire life by basically attending a Speedway event in the early 60s.
Your days of being a promoter at Sheffield were a fair while away. What was your early career like when you left school?
Well, I left school when I was 15 years old, as many people did in those days. I just wanted to go to work and get a job and earn a few quid so that when I turned 16 I could afford to buy a motorbike. It was my entire life's it was my ambition in life up to prior to being 16 to actually have a motorbike when I was 16, and that's pretty much how it unfolded. I went to British Gas when I was 15. I served an apprenticeship. I was fully time served by the time I was 20, and and actually, had letters after my name before I was 21. So,
Wow.
I had a proper trade, which obviously opened doors to go into sales and marketing. Probably 14 years later or something. And I suppose I went to work for Potterton Boilers. I went to work for Clairol, and it was all really about sort of establishing myself in a sales and marketing type environment with blue chip companies, which really is what unfolded and continued pretty much right up to getting this crazy notion of taking over the assets of this thing called Sheffield Speedway.
Someone who was to become a great friend of yours was a certain Rob Woffinden. How did that friendship come about?
Yeah, I remember it as though it was yesterday, to be honest. As many Sheffield people did in those days, went to Scunthorpe. I think it might have been Monday nights in those days. Went to Scunthorpe Speedway. Very, very different to what I'd encountered, obviously, at Overton, and in a different league. And met up with this character who I didn't know from a bar of so actually I met his mum before I did him. This character called Rob Woffinden, and we just sort of had a like-mindedness. We got talking about playing snooker. Neither of us drank, and so we there was a level of sort of like-mindedness from day one. And of course, as the years unfolded, I discovered that Rob Woffinden was a competitor. Didn't matter what we did, whether it was 10-pin bowling, snooker, didn't matter what it was. It was always a world final. Rob was always a competitor, and I have to say, very difficult to beat at anything. I have to say. But hey, the rapport developed. I became his mechanic, travelled the length and breadth of the country. I had a brief encounter when I was about 23, 24 years old. Bought a second-hand Speedway bike. I was obsessed with having a go. I realised I was too big, too old and too poor. I couldn't go to work the following day when I'd been crashed through the fence at Bellevue or Kings Lynn or wherever I'd been to the training school. So I moved on from that because I had to go to work. I had to continue with my commercial career, and so fitting into the mechanical side, fueling and oiling, I guess was second best in my world in those days to actually being a competitor, and Rob Woffinden was it, and we travelled well the length and breadth of the country many times, across Europe on various jaunts, and then later into Australia and here and there. So that relationship just developed. We were always like-minded. We were always on the same page. We never listened to music on those long hauls. We were always in an escort van, and it was always an economy run sort of thing. And that's how it was in those days. And I thrived on it. I planned my work schedules around Rob Woffinden's fixtures. So I didn't miss many fixtures over that period in time, and obviously gained an insight into the other side of the fence in that way.
The thing I'm sort of learning through doing this is the relationship that riders have with their mechanics. You know, they're a lot closer than than is apparent to many fans.
Well, I think that's a very, very valid point that you make, Ian, because, and hey, if you look at my godson, Tai Woffinden, whenever I travel to a GP or something and catch up with Tai and spend a little bit of time before and after meetings and stuff, I always remind his mechanics, people like, well, his main two mechanics, Jacko and Konjo, both Polish guys. I always remind them that they're also 3 times world champion, and of course they've been with him. Really, they marked the change in his levels of success to some extent, and that continuity obviously is a major part of Tai's today's racing schedule, and very, very important elements. Tai knows exactly what he's going to get when he chucks his leg over a bike. and Conjo and Jacko have done the groundwork. They know how to prepare to suit Tai's the characteristics that Tai needs. And it's a great working relationship, and it's a great working partnership, I have to say.
And you must be obviously, I can't imagine the pride you must have in seeing how he's progressed through the sport.
Oh, I'm blown away by it. There's never a day that passes when I don't sort of think, is this a dream? Is this all really unfolded? And I remember being in Torren the first time when Tai became world champion, and it was pretty much nailed on. And as Tai became world champion, and was receiving the bumps and all the stuff on the track, and all the hooters and horns were going in the full stadium, I suddenly felt this sadness come across me, and I must have been the saddest person in the stadium at the time. Didn't really know how to deal with it, because the one person that was missing from it all, of course, was his dad. And it was an odd sort of experience. I was so pleased. It was unbelievable. The whole thing was unbelievable. But his dad not being present was something that a feeling that I'll never forget. And of course, since those days, back in 2013, well, here we are with the most successful British Speedway rider in the history of the sport. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you?
And it's especially when you consider that where he was the first time he was in the GPs, obviously there were extenuating family circumstances there, which I think everybody would understand. But to then go on to be one of the world's greatest riders and the greatest British rider of all time, it's a meteoric rise through the sport.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And people have got short memories sometimes, I mean, when Tai was first offered the wild card when he was, 19 years old, his dad had got, he was terminally ill. He'd got, at that point, he'd got weeks and months to live. Rob knew that Tai wasn't prepared to enter the GP. But how do you tell a 19-year-old that's got a wild card that, he shouldn't be doing it? And he went through an enormous learning curve, finished up pretty much bottom of the pile, and to some extent was written off at that level until he got his second bite of the cherry, which was a couple of years later, and silence his critics is really what Tai was doing. He'd got his act together. I'm not saying he'd got over the departure of his dad, because you'll never get over that, and neither will I. You sort of learn to live with it. Tai got his act together, became a much tougher competitor generally, psychologically, in terms of his physical fitness, and really got a focus on the higher echelons of world speedway, shall we say.
But it all began at Oleton, didn't it? And this is a story that maybe people will find very interesting, because I guess the question comes up to you a lot: why was Tai never a prolific Sheffield rider, considering your relationship with the Woffinden family? But you did give him his break.
When Tai was 15 and came from West Australia and started putting his roots down and showing levels of success, what a lot of people forget is that when Tai Woffinden turned 16 years old, the day he turned 16 happened to coincide with my Thursday race night. Tai had said to me, one of my life's ambitions is to turn out in Sheffield colours on my 16th birthday. I had an opportunity at the time to create a shared reserve position, which was within the rules in those days. I don't know whether it still is or not. And I remember Benji Compton had got that role, and so in order for Tai to actually make his debut on his 16th birthday wearing a Sheffield colour, obviously Benji had to stand down. He probably didn't get it at the time. I'm sure he gets it now. And Tai did actually turn out on his 16th birthday, riding for Sheffield in an official fixture wearing the Sheffield colours. Had the worst meeting of his career, by the way. I don't think he scored a point that night. Had all sorts of problems, which was unusual for him, and Rob being his mechanic and stuff. But anyway, it didn't quite work for him that night. That wasn't the precursor to what happened next. I think he had his own ambitions. He'd been to Wolverhampton. He'd rode the track. He liked the structure. He liked the way that it was unfolding. It was obviously a hot property by the time he turned 16, and he took an enormous motivating deal from Wolverhampton. I had to stand back from it to some extent, because the one thing I didn't want was a war zone within what I considered to be my family.
Sure.
Now, if Tai had have seen things, and Rob at the time, from a different perspective, I would have given him a sort of a freedom of contract type position, which obviously wasn't on the table when he went to Wolves. Whether that would have made any difference or not, well, so hey, Tai went to Wolverhampton. He had some freedom in terms of where he went on loan. Obviously, a good friend of mine, Len Silver, offered him fantastic terms. He went to Rye House. He went from a 3-pointer to a number one in the first set of averages. And I don't think Ty's looked back from those days when he first set foot full time in what used to be the Premier League at Rye House. And indeed, irony crops up all the time, doesn't it, Ian? We found ourselves in the grand final with Rye House that year. And of course, it was Tai that did the damage against us. He came to Sheffield. He had a tremendous season generally, but he had a fantastic meeting in the first leg of the final. We went to Rye House in the second leg. It was going to be a big ask, to be honest. Rye House had got an extremely good team that year. And on the home turf, nobody was getting anywhere near them. We didn't do enough damage on the first leg. Okay, we went there all guns blaring in the second leg, but really it was a bit of a foregone conclusion. We were never winning the league that year, and we never did. We certainly didn't that year anyway. And you know, Rye House became league champions really as a result of this prolific kid that came in as a 3 and finished, I think, somewhere around a 9-point average. I think the following year he went to Wolverhampton and went into the big kids league, and the rest, as they say, is history. You know, the progression that Tai continued to make was solid. It was and hey, you know, I never I never felt embarrassed in any way because Tai didn't sign a Sheffield contract. I felt as though, to some extent, he wanted to make his debut for Sheffield on his 16th birthday. We made that happen. The rest of it didn't fall in as I would have hoped at the time. I'd got a couple of sponsors waiting in the wings who could have probably made a bit of a difference to Tai's general economics at that time, shall we say. But hey, no hard feelings. Wolverhampton were obviously instrumental in Tai's progression, and here we are talking about a bloke who's now the most successful British Speedway rider in the history of the sport. So whether it was good, bad or indifferent to that short-term time frame, well, the bigger picture is certainly very positive, shall we say.
Well, you can always say that you gave him his first official ride, though, eh?
Yeah, and you'd be amazed how many people would actually forget that statistic, by the way, Ian. But it's a true story, and like many other stories, you know, they soon get forgotten. The detail gets forgotten. But hey, that's really how it unfolded, and disappointed at the time, but long term, very positive.
You're listening to the Humans of Speedway podcast. I'm Ian Brannan. I'm in conversation with Neil Machin about his time being a Speedway promoter, 649 meetings at Sheffield, and also quite a few in Leicester as well as a promoter. 28 years in that business. But going right back to the very start, we were talking about your godson there, Tai Woffinden. When Tai was just a twinkle in his dad's eye, just about to come along, you were getting involved on the promotion side at Oleton. How did it all come about? How did you become the man to take Sheffield Speedway forward?
It was never my intention to go that way. Sheffield closed for 2 years when the Taylor report and stuff happened. At the end of the 80s. Personally, I was gutted. Thursday nights was Speedway nights, and for 2 years, no Speedway. Major appeal to my social activities, shall we say? Cliff Carr came in from California, all singing, all dancing. Made all the right sort of noises, etc. Reopened Sheffield with myself and Tim Looking's input and graft, and Cliff Carr went out of business the following season, halfway through. Myself and Tim Looking assisted Cliff to put it all together in a very, very tight time frame. He reopened Sheffield in '91. It was a mega success. But obviously the reopening against the mighty Bellevue was if you're not going to get a crowd for that in those days, well, pack it in before you start, sort of thing. Anyway, so Cliff opened in '91 to an enormous crowd. The crowds returned to some extent. Cliff got it wrong. He wasn't listening to the nuts and bolts of the trading position, shall we say. And halfway through the following season, Cliff was gone. The chairman at the time was Maurice Ducker, who was actually a former promoter at Sheffield, as you know. Myself and Tim Looking, long story short, we actually bought the assets from the bankrupt original company left behind by Cliff Carr. And so that was midway through '92. Myself and Tim, he was the educated person who'd studied politics and journalism and history at Newcastle University. Very, very well read. An enormous influence on my life generally was Tim. And so we set about the job of taking over Sheffield halfway through a season, which wasn't the easiest thing to do. We were as green as grass. We made lots of mistakes. Every mistake we made cost us an absolute fortune. And we had very few rider assets because what we inherited, we could hardly assemble any sort of a team with, let alone a competitive one. So, and then of course, for the next couple of years, we went through all sorts of Tim's heart failure and illness in general terms, and it became clear that at some stage I was going to probably have to take over the reins from Tim and either get out of it or make a fist of it. When you inherit when you inherit a business of any kind that's doing half the turnover that you need to pay the bills, well, it's a bit of a daunting task. Myself and Tim always believed we could do better, and that was really the driving force for us at the time. We invested the thing to actually acquire the assets from the BSPA at the time, and off we went, making mistakes that all cost us a fortune, and I don't really know how I do. I know how we survived in the early years because I propped the thing up in a financial way. And of course, in the early years, getting back to a break-even number was the prime objective, and it probably took 2 or 3 years I think I inherited about 600 people a week, and I needed 1,100 to pay the bills in those days. Tim had Tim's heart problems weren't obviously improving. He was never in the list for a heart and lung transplant, which is pretty much what Tim had to have. And sadly, as we got to 96, which was the one big league in British Speedway, which was such a problem to us. We didn't have any riders. We were scratching around the world looking for anybody who'd got a bike and who was available. And so we were always in the lower regions of the league and finding results very, very difficult, and try and promote a product on the back of that kind of those kind of results. But hey, 96 came along. Tim wasn't getting any better. He died, and left me in an enormous dilemma. And I have to say that throughout my entire Speedway career at Sheffield, which spanned 22, 23 seasons, I was always fortunate in that I always had some very, very solid people close in, and of course Tim's departure brought in Malcolm Wright. Malcolm Wright was an absolute pleasure to have on board. We always agreed on all the major issues. One of the few partnerships in this industry that actually worked, and we always agreed on all the major issues. David Hoggart came on board later. Peter Curry came on board later. All people that were lower level type characters, but their contribution, I certainly couldn't have tackled the enormity of that kind of a project without those key people close in. I also had tremendous track staff who basically were there forever, stayed with me through thick and thin. John Whittaker will probably talk about later. He was the clerk of the course. He was a safe pair of hands. The track staff generally, they were all on side. They all knew exactly what they were doing. If I gave them a shirt and a jacket and a cap and a pair of trousers to wear, then they wore it with great pride, and they all knew their job. And that pretty much continued right through to my departure in 2013.
Obviously, running a speedway club brings many surprises, and I imagine, as you mentioned there, in the first few years, there was a lot of things that probably came out of the woodwork that you weren't expecting. What are the things about running a speedway club in that way that maybe generally fans don't realise that you have to factor in?
Well, first of all, you've got the obvious things like officialdom, VAT, annual accounts, accountancy, acquiring assets. You can't acquire assets without the resource to do so. Improving the presentation. All these things boil back to the same issue. You have to get commercially sound to have the resource to invest in all manner of assets, and obviously riders became the key thing as far as our patrons were concerned. But there was a much wider perspective out there as well, developing relationships with the press and media, developing relationships with commercial entities who were looking to raise the profile locally. And banging the drum and getting out there with messages and with leaflet drops and posters in windows and general promotional activity. In the early days, we never actually had a weekend off because we were doing summer galas and fetes, and wherever there was people, I wanted a presence. And in those days, I had riders that would actually bring bikes and give up their Saturday or Sunday to attend. So we sort of raised the profile. There was lots of legwork. There was lots of pitfalls. And we also discovered in the early days that some of those people in the BSPA, the big fish, the big sharks, had got extremely sharp teeth. So a lot of things we sort of we took on board. We learned from our mistakes. We had to. In the early days, it was about survival mode. Later, it became about having something tangible to invest into, like Speedway riders, etc. And the whole thing needed that financial investment, and the only place it was coming from was actually increased footfall figures. And dare I say that word, profit, because profit does fund everything. Increased crowd levels makes so many problems go away, and of course, starting off with no Speedway riders wasn't a smart thing to do when you're running a Speedway track and operating in a league structure. So we invested in the youth development side of the thing, and we can sort of come on to that if we've got time later. I'm sure of it.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, actually, in terms of the riders, you said that you started with nothing and you were scrabbling round, but which riders started to bring it round for you then when you got things going?
Well, I'd have to say that going back to 94 was an absolute commercial disaster. We were still as green as grass. We hadn't got anywhere near break even. We invested in the biggest signing that Sheffield could have made it at that time, a character by the name of Sean Moran. Sean, to describe him by his situation as Tim Lucking did, Sean, with only a handful of meetings into the season, had a crisis of confidence. I don't believe he's ever thrown his leg over a Speedway bike since. And a major setback, a record signing, an enormous financial commitment. Sean did a few meetings at home, retired. We had no number one, and we still owed, I don't know, £10,000 or £12,000 on his transfer fee at the time. So 94 was a struggle. The same year, I transferred Rodney Calhoun from Peterborough. He did the season, halved his average and never came back. So that wasn't exactly the best investment we ever made.
It's not stacking up as a very good season at all, this, is it, Neil?
94 was I tell you what, if you could get over 94, you could live with just about anything. We had lots of rain-offs. We had to restructure the team. The brightest thing about 94 was bringing Greg Bartlett from West Australia. He was such a prolific novice, and I have to describe him that way because I'd actually witnessed him in West Australia. He'd done about 3 or 4 meetings at Claremont, and we threw him straight into the league program here in the UK. So he was the bright part of 94, and we had stacks of rain off. And actually, something that people will find probably unbelievable in this era, we had 8 outstanding fixtures to stage at home in October, and we were running Thursdays and Sundays and Thursdays and Mondays and Thursdays and Sundays right through the month. Never had a rain off. Got through the whole thing and actually finished the last day of October on a Monday night with a Northern Riders Championship. I must have had some energy in those days. and of course Tim as well, we must have had some energy in those days.
2 or 3 times a week, eh?
Well, at least twice at home during the month of October. And of course we also had a smattering of away commitments to undertake as well. So a 94, commercially an absolute write-off. We'd spent the money. We had no Sean Moran. We had no Rodney Calhoun. But the brightest thing about it, of course, is that we did have well, actually, I think I brought in 3 riders that year. Greg Bartlett to start the season. Robbie Kessler came in later, who turned out to be an absolute gentleman to deal with and a prolific figure around Sheffield for many years to come. And George Stansel came into the equation.
Of course, yeah.
So, it was sort of a couple of steps forward and 3 going backwards in a way, because obviously we didn't need to sign Rodney and Sean and lose them within the first season, shall we say. The investment in the other 3, Stansel, Robbie Kessler, and Greg Bartlett, should have been the icing on the cake. They actually became the cake. So, 94, it was very testing times. I think we probably just about got out of jail at the end of 94, but we had enormous financial losses because, because of the money that we owed, that was still remaining on bad transfers that we'd entered the market with. So another error, another costly mistake. 95 came in, and the last thing we needed right at that point in time was to actually go up a league. And of course, 95 came in with the one big league. A major problem. We had tremendous support from our landlords at the time. Dave Allen, who owns Oulton Stadium and a string of casinos, he saw the writing on the wall. He saw the problems that we'd got to deal with. Actually, Dave Allen, without any begging bowls or anything, he came across with a year's free rent. He understood the economic and commercial strain we were going to be under, especially going to the higher league, and obviously different pay structures and all the rest. And so 95 and 96, as I mentioned before, 95, I suppose the purple patch really, or the positive thing was about the general development of Greg Bartlett. I had Roman Matusek in the team, who probably saved my entire business in those days, to be honest, Ian, because he gave me something tangible to sell. And what a prolific product to have to sell as people like Roman Matusek. He was the consummate entertainer. He probably didn't realise that at the time, but he certainly knew how to play to the gallery, and he had the Sheffield people. They worshipped him almost as a god, because he was such a prolific entertainer. He wasn't scoring maximums every week, but wherever he went, he was Roman the showman. He was the bouncing check. Everywhere up and down the country had their lead story about this nutcase called Roman Matusek, who actually at that time had appeared in 5 world finals. God knows how he ever got there, but that was statistics. And hey, I have to say, God rest his soul, I was sorry to hear of his premature departure, shall we say. Roman Matusek, I will always have a special feeling about Roman whenever his name crops up, because he really did almost single-handedly save my business. He gave my patrons something to cheer, something to relate to, and he was really the icon that sort of kept the whole thing together in a way, even though he was the most unreliable character you've ever met in your life. And everybody's got a story about Roman Matusek. And most of the stories I could tell you about Roman would be very, very positive, very much the hard man, and really there was an aggression in him which I think Joe Public really warmed to. Heroes and villains maybe, Roman was the villain. And he was very good at being the villain, I can assure you. So, hey, whatever it takes to pay the bills, Roman Matusek was at the forefront, really, of a shall we say, creating this business into a commercial success in a way.
I suppose as a promoter, that you want a good balance, don't you, of people who are going to be reliable, are going to be going to do the job on the track, of course, but you've got to have a bit of a budget for a few wild cards, haven't you, that are going to entertain. And how much is that a consideration when you're looking at signing a rider for a season beyond what maybe their average is versus what they bring in terms of being able to promote your club with them, like you just mentioned there with Roman?
Well, for me, promoting the brand and promoting the club was my prime objective. And so I'm sure that when it came to doing the Mad Axeman stories for the local press and media, I mean, they thrived on it. And to some extent, it was the local media that made Roman into this, gave him this bad boy image, always the villain, and yeah, whatever it takes to put the numbers through the gates on a Thursday night. Roman was certainly supportive as far as that was concerned, and really, I had him staying with me numerous times. It was an absolute gent to having you under your roof. It wasn't the nutcase that people that was the facade that he created. So hey, you're never going to forget me saying anything or find me saying anything negative about Roman Matusek, because I believe that he was instrumental in keeping my wheels turning until better times arrived. And of course, in those days, there was no guarantees of better times arriving, Ian. We're talking about the mid-90s here. We'd gone through the upheaval of the one big league. Whether it was good, bad or indifferent, the big kids in that one big league, they felt that entertaining Sheffield in their business and Edinburgh and Newcastle and those sort of clubs, they felt it was bad for their business. They'd got teams full of superstars. We were never getting access to those superstars. The thing was never going to work. There was a 4-point differential in team build, I remember, in '96. So you had to come above 42, but you had to be below 46. All the big kids, the Coventrys, the Bradfords, the big kids, the Pools, Swindons, they'd all got the big kids, and they weren't releasing them. So, we were scrapping to get a team over the 42-point level, and they were all scrapping to get a millionth of a point under the 46. You'd got a 4-point differential across the league. 2 leagues in one was the outcome, not rocket science. End of '96. They had clandestine meetings and decided that they were going to form this thing called the Elite League, and that happened. And I suppose to some extent it was a breath of fresh air for people like me, because we were never going to be able to employ the world superstars, especially when they were contracted to the Elite League characters, shall we say. So and of course '97 came along, the first year of the one big league. It was won by Bradford. I remember being at Bradford for the last ever meeting that they staged, in front of 700 people, lifted the silverware, great big stadium, superb presentation, which was really Alan Ham's hallmark in British Speedway. Couldn't believe that so few people had rocked up to see the mighty Bellevue in town and see Bradford lift the inaugural Elite League trophy. Anyway, Bradford disappeared at the end of that first year in the Elite League. The Premier League got stronger and stronger. And of course, suddenly we arrived in 1999, and suddenly Sheffield had a prolific all-English team who pretty much dominated proceedings at the Premier League that year. And amazingly, Sheffield went from being the making up the numbers team to the out and out glamour team in the league, actually in the entire industry. 99 was a major changing point for Sheffield. It was the first time in its 70-year history that they actually won the league championship. The pride for me personally was immense. All English team, in fact, almost an all Yorkshire team. Reg as the team manager. Fantastic. We suddenly became the glamour team. We suddenly started attracting new faces. Crowd levels were growing. We had the resource to do things, to invest in presentation. We had the resource to invest in transferring riders in. And suddenly the world became a better place to operate in, having had 6.5 years of toil and trouble and conflict, wheeling and dealing, teaming and ladling. And of course, trying to get out of that mode of surviving commercially was never really far away from me, because I always knew that being tight was really about survival. And of course, I'd got everything on the line by now. I'd got enormous investment in Sheffield. Years earlier, it had become the only business, or the only business interest I had. And so really, I had to make it work. It's as simple as that. And of course, when people used to call me a tight bastard, if you can use that terminology on your podcast.
Absolutely, yeah, don't worry about that.
Okay, when people used to call me tight bastard, I used to get really, really down about it, because I'd got just about everything I owned on the line by that point.
I'm sure that people from Sheffield have heard worse in their time. But when you're talking about that, and you mentioned Bradford a little while ago there, when they closed, did you see more people coming through your gates, though, sort of displaced Bradford fans getting down to Oleton to take some Speedway in?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? Bradford ceased. I expected to get a greater level of travelling from West Yorkshire. I think there was a small influence there, difficult to measure, by the way.
I did, Neil, so you can add me to it.
Okay. Hey, I suppose I probably overestimated the effect it was going to have when Bradford closed, in terms of those West Yorkshire folk travelling down to Sheffield. And of course, the year later, Long Eaton closed, which should have also given us a shot in the arm. And I think it possibly did, in a marginal sort of way. So both our nearest rivals in over a couple of years actually ceased to trade. So we should have been in a stronger commercial position, and perhaps we were. Certainly things obviously got easier following 99, because we were then the glamour club. We had a better following generally. People expected us to be up at the top of the league and making progress in knockout cups and stuff. People expected us to sort of get results on the road or go close away from home. Maybe you set a high benchmark for yourself by doing that, but hey, all I can say is that in the 70-year history of Sheffield, to actually be the person that secured the first league championship with TC Harrison's Ford on our race jacket was an enormous change in fortunes, an enormous breakthrough, and commercially really bolstered our position in a way. And obviously it coincided with Sean Wilson's arrival, and of course Stonewar's departure. So one thing balanced it. But Sean was such a prolific number one, and 99, Sean thrived on the whole thing. He thrived on the success. He thrived on his own prolific performances home and away. he was very much the figurehead of the team for many seasons to come. And so the thing started to come right. We had a different label. We were considered in a different way by people because we were league champions. And you sort of get a bit of a swagger about you, You see it with the team on the track walk. You see it in all manner of things. A bit of a sort of a confident type swagger, which was a new experience for me because, of course, we'd always been in the doldrums for the previous 6.5 years. So, and I remember writing something one day, Ian, where you get so used to dealing with disappointments and not quite getting the results here and there, shall we say, that when you actually get success, you're not really geared up to knowing how to deal with it or knowing how to maximise the effect of it. And I can say that that's one of my experiences going back to '99. But hey, the expectancy increased, the crowd levels increased, obviously. And everything in the garden was fairly rosy. We didn't dominate everything for the next whatever amount of years, but certainly it was a very, very solid starting point where we silenced our critics, and we were actually running a business where we were paying our bills without too much teaming and ladling, and we'd actually got a resource to invest in presentation, in dressing the team, dressing the track staff, spending money on consumer advertising, spending more money on promotional items, etc. And I guess we had to get to that point before we had that resource, and I always had this obsession with utilising that resource in order to grow and build the business for the future, which is pretty much, I have to say, that blueprint did unfold in that way to some extent.
This is the Humans of Speedway podcast. I'm Ian Brannan. We're in conversation with Neil Machin, 28 years as a Speedway promoter, 649 meetings at Sheffield alone. He's going to be doing his latest bit of promoting very soon because we're going to get him to choose his ultimate 1 to 7 and where he would hold that meeting as well. And what rule he'd change. Stay tuned for that. But success, Neil, to be successful, you need to have a team on the track and also a great team off the track too.
Yeah, and I remember making an effort to project exactly my appreciation for those guys wherever I possibly could, because really they were committed, and it wasn't about money. As you well know, track staff do not get paid. And getting a professional sort of turnout with stability, and of course, I had a nucleus of track staff that would come in on a Wednesday night to do painting and general tidying and stuff that our paying public never saw, never even knew was going on. But these projects were going on, and I had a nucleus of track staff who were totally reliable. If we usually on a Saturday we'd run a training school on a small track, and 3 or 4 of the track staff would come in, and we'd do a section of replacing the safety fence on the big track, digging out and all the manual sort of behind the scenes stuff, clearing the drains, all that stuff. And I couldn't have done that without the commitment from those key people. Some of them, people like Kevin Lilly and Paul Brown, Winston on the back gate, they were just nailed on, totally solid, totally reliable, and I consider every one of those people to be my personal friends here today, donkey's years later, and that will probably be relationships that were formed through Speedway that will probably go on throughout my entire life, and I hope that's mutual, by the way.
I'm sure it will be. And it's a year or two since I've actually been to Sheffield, due to mainly work commitments. Really, I was always working when you were on.
Yeah.
But I know that John would always be sat by the pit gate.
Yes.
And you knew when the full meeting had finished when they carried his chair across the track. That's how I judged it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, John Whittaker was really the safe pair of hands. We always had a great rapport. I always extended the normal courtesies to John as the clerk of the course. If I was taking people on the infield, I always cleared it with John. He never ever said no, but it was just courteous to ask. And we had rules, and obviously everybody knew their position. John Whittaker was the boss of the operational pits area. Been there and worn the T-shirt, was licensed by the SCB for donkey's years, something like 60 years indeed.
Wasn't he a referee as well?
He was. His first job in Speedway was actually at Bradford as a colour marshal, where they used to hand out the helmet colours.
Right.
So a snippet there. Going back to when he was, I don't know, a young bloke of early 20s or something. Yes, he was a fully fledged SCB referee and an FIM referee, by the way. So I was fortunate to inherit John Whittaker as my clerk of the course. We had a great rapport that spanned pretty much my entire time at Sheffield. Up to 2013. John always said, he was always talking about retiring, and I always said to John, well, when you retire, I'm retiring as well. And actually, not that it was controlled in any way that way, but that's pretty much how it panned out, because I sold the business at the end of 13, and John Whittaker had already come to a conclusion that he was going to retire from his clerk of the course duties. So actually what we always talked about in jest actually became reality, and John Whittaker was a solid character, a great character to have in your pits, knew the rules inside out, and was just a great figurehead who commanded a level of respect. And hey, you know, people underestimate the role of a clerk of the course in Speedway. He is the most important person in the stadium. He is the person who will be interviewed by officialdom, coroners if you get a serious incident unfolding. And his position within any Speedway track should be marked with a much greater level of respect than it is, possibly, only my opinion.
And a huge responsibility on you as well, I would imagine, being the promoter. You know, it's down to you. Ultimately, your name's above the door on the promotion of the club to make sure you've got a safe track, to make sure that the facilities are safe for the fans as well, and that everything's enjoyed as well as it can be.
Yeah, it's a very, very solid point, to be honest, Ian. At the end of my term at Sheffield, it was one of the fears I always had in the back of my mind. We're in a very, very dangerous industry. Injuries are always never going to be too far away from you, and you're always going to get a broken ankle or a broken shoulder or worse. But we never got anybody killed, and I don't think we ever got anybody crippled. So I suppose I would regard that as to some extent as an achievement. And really, that was as a result of complying. I mean, you got to remember that I went into Sheffield very few years after 96 bodies at Hillsborough. So you can imagine the scrutiny that we were under, being a mile from Sheffield Wednesday, where they had the Hillsborough disaster.
Well, you're on the same road, aren't you? It's just literally
it's actually less than half a mile indeed. So you can imagine the scrutiny we were under in terms of health and safety issues, and that just became the norm. And I suppose we had no option but to comply. And I suppose that compliance and the rules that were set out by the local authority probably lent towards minimising the injuries, shall we say. I was pleased to come out of it without without those kind of upheavals that some of my colleagues did obviously have to live with and encounter throughout their careers. And so I was pleased to come out of it without those, without that burden, shall we say. But hey, Sheffield was a very different place to operate than any other speedway track in the country in those days because of what we just talked about with the Hillsborough disaster and being local authority health and safety people were almost running scared and paranoid. So if it didn't say it in the book, I can assure you it wasn't happening. And hey, there was a few heated moments, but we were all on the same page, and we sort of got through it.
We've talked mainly about your time at Sheffield so far, but after Sheffield, you became involved in the promotion at Leicester, which I know was slightly related to Sheffield at the time. But how did all that come about?
Yeah, what was going on at Sheffield was that I'd agreed to retain my licence there because they needed a vote in General Council, and because they got a new consortium that was moving in. In the first year, certainly, I became their voting member and just retained my licence. They then, the new owners decided to restructure, bring new, consortium members into the BSPA. At the same time, I had a discussion with David Hemsley, who I pretty much sort of brought into the sport for good, bad or indifferent. And David said, take a licence with Leicester, deal with commercial issues, blah, blah, blah. And really, I felt as though I was a bit sort of surplus at Sheffield. People were asking me questions that weren't where I wasn't the person that they should have been asking or tendering answers. So it was pretty straightforward for me to actually take a licence at Leicester, which I did under David Helmsley's promotion, along with Dave Darcy, and hey, I was in a different situation at Leicester because I was pretty much focused purely on commercial aspects, having rapport with sponsors, corporate partners, if you like to call them, dealing with certain aspects of the media, really setting up promotions. Decision making wasn't my thing. Because it wasn't my business anymore, and I was never making decisions that somebody else was going to pay for. So trundle along in that way at Leicester for I don't know, 4 years or 5 years or whatever it was, and some major upheavals, I have to say. And of course, Leicester made the big mistake of going to the higher league when they didn't have the resource to do so. Put them under enormous commercial pressure, which I don't think I think everybody's aware of that actually happened. And hey, I just got to the point where back in January of this year, there were things happening that where I felt as though I was going to be exposed to, in a way, to things that I didn't agree with. In the sport in general, I sort of came to a conclusion that I'd got other things to do with my life, and I resigned from the BSPA and from Leicester from by email from Australia. I think probably first week into January. No hard feelings, no regrets. I served some time there. I did some positive things for Leicester. We just encountered the most successful story in British Speedway going back many, many years. And Leicester really dominated the league last year and won everything. It was a great feeling to be part of that, along with Stuart Dixon, who became the key to it all, and the full-time nuts and bolts team manager stroke promoter. Leicester will continue and will now become the glamour club of when Speedway does get operational again. Leicester will become the club where everybody wants to take a point off them, and they will, I think, develop that swagger that we talked about because of the success of last year. It was great to be part of it, I suppose to some extent I felt like yesterday's man, and I didn't agree with the way that the sport was going in general terms. And even though I was instrumental in negotiating with TV companies and stuff last year as a management committee member, I just felt as though my time was going to move into other things. So that brings us bang up to date, I think.
You've mentioned a couple of times there about the potential mistake of going into the top league. Obviously, Sheffield have now done that. Obviously, they haven't ridden yet. What is the potential pitfall there, and how severe are the differences between the two leagues financially?
Well, to be honest, Ian, this was going back to the days in the 2004, 2005-ish. Going back to those days, I was being lobbied strongly to put Sheffield in that top league, not only by members of the Elite League, as it was, but also my sponsors at the time wanted me to go there because they wanted some TV, which was Pertec. They were desperate to get some TV. I looked at the entire equation and I knew that I was going to lose my Thursday night race night, which had been carved in stone since God was a boy. I knew that I would be going against clubs that had already established Thursday, and I knew that I would be moving to Mondays to deal with TV fixtures, etc. Plus the fact that I was then going to be into employing Grand Prix type expensive people in heat leader roles. It wasn't really my thing. Many people have proven it. I mean, Leicester came back out of the what used to be the Elite League. Business was better. They went back to their traditional race night of Saturday. The whole equation was much better at the lower level for Leicester. I couldn't tell you whether it would have been at Sheffield. I didn't want to lose my Thursday race night either, and I certainly didn't want to sacrifice it to other tracks who got priority and finish up staging Mondays. And of course, hey, I had to ask myself and many other people the same question. If you're running on a Thursday and you have to stage a meeting next Monday, do you actually ditch the meeting the Thursday before or the Thursday after? Because either way, you're going to be staging 2 top class events in 3 or 4 days. And I could not see the commercial benefits in doing that. And that's pretty much was one of my dominant thoughts in terms of staying away from the top league. My crowd levels weren't that different to the top league, and the only thing that made the difference, of course, Ian, was this thing called the TV money. Now, we've all got our own opinions about the TV, the live TV show, and the resource that's gone with it. I mean, let's not forget the TV money's been dominating British Speedway now for 20 years. Personally, I think that a lot of the TV money that we've had over the years could have been spent in a more effective way. It could have been spent in a way where the industry in general could have grown through promotional activity and consumer advertising, etc. But hey, that wasn't happening. I think the TV money probably was really the deciding factor, certainly in the last 20 years, in terms of where you go. And of course, the other factor, and Sheffield's a classic example, they desperately needed, having tried Sundays last year, they needed to get back to a Thursday. The only way they could do that with designated race nights was to actually move up a league to retain or to get back to their Thursday race night. So, things have changed in terms of the decision-making process or the whys and wherefores or the reason for doing this or not. 20 years ago, slightly different reasons. Today, designated race nights. If you're in the top league, you've got to race Monday and Thursday. You've got all the humbug because people are going to be in Poland. They're going to be missing meetings. Not good for your paying public. They don't want to support part-time riders who are in Poland or doing Grand Prix or doing World Championship events or team events or, I always wanted to put out the same 7 riders every week. And I suppose to some extent that was always my prime objective, shall we say. So I stayed away from the top league, and I think there's good reason and evidence to support that decision. And I never had anybody lobbying me on the terraces wanting to go to the Elite League.
It's funny how it's changed around, isn't it? To keep your Thursday race night.
Yes,
it meant staying away from it before, but now it means doing it now.
Entirely right. Yeah. Now, if I'd have been faced with that scenario, I couldn't preempt what I would have done. But you're absolutely right. The criteria changed. The designated race nights for that league are Mondays and Thursdays. I always felt it was a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. I always hated this concept of uncontrolled doubling up. I was part of the decision making years ago when doubling up was first discussed and created. It had to be controlled. It wasn't controlled. It became an easy way to employ a team without actually bringing new faces in, without the expense of people travelling in, flying out. Totally alien to me. Riders flying in, flying out. That was, that wasn't in my equation in any way, shape, or form. And actually, years ago, when I had to bring Roman Matusek in from Czechia or Zoltan Adorjan from Hungary, it was bloody expensive, man. And that was many, many years earlier. So I never wanted to go in that direction. I always wanted to put out the same people. And I didn't want to be operating a business that was dominated by Poland. And whether we like it or hate it, that's really where it's up to.
You're listening to the Humans of Speedway podcast. I'm Ian Brannan, and I'm in conversation with legendary British promoter Neil Machin. 28 years promoting Speedway in Great Britain, mainly at Sheffield, 649 meetings, and at Leicester as well. And he's going to be picking his all-time 1 to 7 and telling us which rule he'd change. Stay tuned, details on the way. But when you look back at your career, Neil, what are your achievements that make you most proud over that time?
Well, I would have to say, quite a few of them actually. In terms of key, to spend 28, to operate within the BSPA for 28 years is in itself, in my world, an achievement. Bolted into that, everybody got paid as per their deal. If you ever come across anybody who tells you that I owed them a penny, then you can safely call them a liar. That was always top of my agenda, shall we say. My team and the BSPA got paid when I didn't, and that happened many, many times. Not complaining, that's how it was. As we said earlier, no one got crippled or worse. I stayed 649 meetings. And actually, I have to say that a major surprise, going back to a few years now, 5, 6 years, whatever, I was actually voted by the referees to receive the Jeff Dolby Award, which is a sort of an award that's presented on an annual basis. Jeff Dolby being a former SCB referee who sadly died. An award was left in his memory to allocate to a person who made a contribution to the industry, and shock and surprise, I was awarded the Jeff Dolby Award, and when I looked at the roll of honour of people whose names was on that trophy, I was moved. I was humbled by it. To be recognised by the SCB and its referees who voted that my name should appear on the Jeff Dolby Award might be something that you'd never heard of. To me, it was a tremendous achievement. Obviously, winning 2 league championships, knockout cups, all the rest of it. The league championships are the biggie. After the league championship, if you can't become the league champion, then you want to win the knockout cup or the Young Shield or the, whatever it's called these days. But hey, 2 league championships, okay. You might say, well, 2 league championships in 22 years ain't that good a batting average. And maybe I would agree with that. But hey, to win 2 was a hell of a lot better than anything in the previous history of Sheffield Speedway. And of course, I had tremendous pride and achievement winning the first one in '99, 70 years after Sheffield first set foot in as a speedway venue. So yeah, lots of achievements, lots of relationships with riders all over the planet. Which still, those relationships, although most people are retired now, they continue. And what a journey! I have to say, what a fantastic journey. And of course the journey continues. I have no idea what happens next, what happens next year, what happens this year, or the year after. But what a journey, and I can only relate to the positive aspects of that journey, even though, as you can well appreciate, there was its negative aspects as well. But we tend to focus on the more positive stuff, don't we?
Well, they're talking about Bradford making a comeback. Would you be interested?
No, I'm retired. I'm yesterday's man. I wouldn't have the enthusiasm or the energy that I had when I was 40 years old. I have to say that I've been supporting and assisting Robbie Grant to get into Newcastle. Really, because I see lots of attributes in Robbie Grant and his acquisition of Newcastle. I see lots of attributes that I had when I was this age, or slightly older, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So, no, I wish the Bradford thing luck. I know that there's going to be all sorts of issues to actually get Bradford to the tapes again, as it were. I know that Tony Moll spent a small fortune in investigating Bradford, and he drew a blank. Whether Steve Reese has got some different criteria, well, that remains to be seen. And of course, Steve Reese is under pressure as a stock car promoter because, as you know, he's lost Stoke. There are strong indications he's going to lose Bellevue, and he's looking for a venue, and maybe Bradford being on his doorstep is something that Steve Reese is going to pursue. And let's see. One thing I do know is that Bradford will not be able to exist specifically purely on stock cars. So if it's going to have a blueprint of success in any way commercially, they're going to need some speedway in there at some level. I don't know much about the nuts and bolts of it, but I have heard the same noises about Bradford.
We'll keep an eye on that, and it will be great if that could get off the ground for sure. You are listening to the Humans of Speedway podcast. I'm Ian Brannan, and this Neil, could be, well, your final promotion then, because it's time to do your Speedway Paradise. We're going to come up with your ultimate meeting, and we're going to find out your 1 to 7 of all time. We're going to find out which rule you would change, but we're going to start off by asking you, Neil, which track would we be racing this ultimate meeting of yours on?
Well, I'd have to say Sheffield, because it is the fastest racetrack in British Speedway, because I've sort of grown up in that venue. It's probably had more investment in that venue than all the rest of the tracks in the industry in British Speedway. I'd have to say Sheffield. Having said that, the most prolific racing you will ever see is actually a track that Rob Woffinden built in West Australia some years ago, as Tai was being a young bloke doing his first laps, and Pinjar Park creates what I would suggest is Speedway for the connoisseur, and very, very different, the two venues I mentioned. Sheffield being the fastest track in British Speedway. Pinjar Park, I don't think it'd even qualify to be in British Speedway because it's a very, very small Costa Mesa type venue, but entertaining the paying public and giving them close, exciting racing that they understand, really, I suppose, was always my objective.
So not a huge surprise then. The event's going to be at Sheffield, of course. Where else for Neil Machin? What about your all-time 1 to 7 then, Neil? I know that you've given it some great thought already.
Well, I have, and people will say, well, it's easy to pick a team full of former world champions, and you'd be absolutely right. I'll just run through them very, very briefly.
Go on then.
Obviously, my list would have to start with Tai Woffinden, the most successful British Speedway rider in the history, and he's my godson. So I think I have to be allowed that indiscretion, shall we say. Bruce Penhall, the consummate, the pin-up boy. You know, he'd got it all. We failed to maximise the effect of having Penhall in British League. But hey, what colour and profile did he bring to the industry? I think he's probably the only Speedway rider ever to receive telegrams from the President of the US on becoming world champion. Ivan Major would have to be in that identified in that list. Total professional. What a fantastic character to deal with. Obviously, he always knew his value. He brought sponsors and corporates into World Speedway, and who could ever create a list of this kind without including the great Ivan Major? I have Greg Bartlett and Roman Matusek on my list because Greg Bartlett was the unfulfilled potential. He rode in British League for 2 years. He could have gone all the way. I spend lots of time with Greg. He's an engine tuner, is a very, very solid, reliable character, and he could have gone all the way in World Speedway, but hey, that didn't happen. But in terms of prolific from zero to hero in 2 years, not many riders will come in as a novice and the following year be taking Sam Ermolenko from behind at Sheffield. That was Greg's potential. Roman Matusek saved my bacon. He was the entertainer. He was the villain in general terms. He was considered by many people to be the villain, but he entertained my public. And once if we ever get away from entertaining our patrons, then we are in trouble. Peter Collins would have to be on my list because Peter became world champion in '76, and Peter was always box office. If you'd got him in a meeting anywhere in his heyday, he would swallow the crowd. And of course, how could I not include Greg Hancock? Because Greg has really rewritten the record books with every time he threw his leg over a bike in the last couple of seasons anyway. Turned 50 the other day, did Greg. Known him since he was probably a 16 or 17 year old, go back a long way. Tremendous respect for Greg. What a fantastic profile for World Speedway. And of course, all of these people on my list have you may say, well, it's obvious that you're going to include people who've got 16 world championships between them, which I have done. But commercially, good business. Speedway is a business. And the people who think it's a Saturday night toy, think again, get into promoting Speedway and get into growing the business.
So a lineup of all-stars at Sheffield for your ultimate meeting, but now here's the exciting one for you, Neil. We'll give you the rule book. Which rule is the one that you're going to change?
Well, actually, there are two.
Go on then, I'll let you have two. Off you go.
Gardening at the start is an embarrassment to the industry and could very, very easily be stopped. And if you was to draw a line 3 meters back from the start line and nobody moves into that line prior to being under starters orders, then you'd stop all that gardening, getting off bikes, kicking shale. It's all an embarrassment to me, and I think it is to our paying public.
Okay.
And I think it's a pretty easy fix if we were serious about it. And I think it should be compulsory for every team in British Speedway to wear the corporate gear. And if a sponsor's put in £2 or £2,000 or 20 grand, doesn't matter. Every team should have its identity and should be dialed in totally to who their sponsor's identity is, and it should be within every contract, and it should be compulsory, and it might just give us a more professional outlook to the outside world.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because I think, the teams that do all match, the Polish teams, for example, do it, don't they? And it does look great.
Well, not just teams. I mean, obviously, team members become the focal point, but dressing your track staff, projecting your sponsor's identity through your, we've all got 30 track staff or 25 track staff or something. What a fantastic opportunity we have to project our sponsor's identity. Very few tracks do that. You can't tell the track staff from the paying public. So I just think that we ought to sharpen up lots of those. And we're talking about presentation aspects here. The one thing that disappoints me in Speedway in general terms is the presentation. You look at any Grand Prix, wherever it is, the presentation is superb. It's something that's obviously had some investment. And you look at most of the domestic presentation and it's pretty tosh. Desperately needs some investment, and definitely needs a fresh pair of eyes to actually bring it up to, where are we, 2020. It's probably going to be 2021 before we really get operational. So hey, let's get into 2021 and stop messing around as though we're in the mid-70s, eh?
There you go, you see, the thoughts of Neil Machin. Stop messing around when it comes to presentation in Speedway. Neil, that sounds like a fantastic meeting, and thanks for sharing your thoughts. The final question for you is, what's next for Neil Machin then?
Yeah, I'm going to be trucking off to West Australia shortly when flights allow. I've just bought a new apartment on the marina at the place called Mindarie. And I've got to buy some furniture and a fridge and a settee and stuff like that, and actually look at the marina. So I'm sort of looking forward to that, to be honest.
Sounds nice.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Neil, and thanks for sharing all your stories.
It's all a true story, by the way.
Thanks to Neil Machin for joining me on the Humans of Speedway podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening. It was so insightful, and I know that we barely scratched the surface, but we'll certainly do more in future, I'm sure, because it's very hard to condense such a long history in the sport down into such a short space of time. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast series so you get new episodes when they're released, and give us a rating too if you've enjoyed it. And I'll be back soon with another Human of Speedway to chat to. In the meantime, take care and stay safe.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projection for a wide variety of stats, and place your entry. It's as easy as that. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. Easy gameplay, quick withdrawals, and injury insurance on your picks are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Ready to test your skills? Join the Prize Picks community of more than 7 million players who have already signed up. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/get100 and use code GET100. That's code GET100 at prizepicks.com/get100. for a first deposit matchup to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy.